Welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and this is Magic rules you might be getting wrong. Just answering my viewers' questions about interactions they're not sure about. Let's start off with a couple simple ones this time. Null Elemental Blast requires a wastes, correct? No, it does not require a waste. It requires a colorless mana, and there might be a little bit of confusion here, particularly with newer players, because of course the whole colorless mana thing came about after Magic had been around for a long, long time, and they did a lot of switching, right? So let's look at Null Elemental Blast. It costs 1 colorless mana. It's an instant. Counter target multicolored spell or destroy target multicolored permanent. So you need a colorless mana, that specific pip, in order to cast this. And as I've said in the past, when they created the whole colorless mana thing, they essentially created a new color in the game of Magic, because of course we do indeed have a basic land that does produce colorless mana. However, there's a whole lot of other things that produce colorless mana, and this is where the confusion can come into. Something that almost every single commander deck has is a Sol Ring that produces colorless mana. Again, if you look at the newer versions, it's been updated with those colorless pips. Of course, that never used to be a thing, so older versions of that card will show the generic mana symbol, right? Those are different. Generic mana and colorless are different. Colorless means you actually need those pips, whereas generic mana means you can use any color mana. I can use colorless, I can use green, red, blue, whatever. It doesn't matter the mana that you're using. I will go out on a limb and say 100% of lands that used to have the generic mana symbol now produce colorless mana. So there's actually a lot of ways to produce colorless mana. It's likely that if you have a commander deck, there is an option for producing colorless mana in your deck, probably even in a 5-color deck, you can do it. So no, you don't need a wastes. If I control a Leyline of Singularity and an opponent casts 3 treasure tokens, will 2 of those tokens die to the legend rule before they have a chance to use them? And of course, the answer absolutely is yes. Just talked about this in a video about hating on treasure tokens, in fact, and there are other effects that do this. Eye of Singularity, very similar effect in white that will do the same thing, but let's look at Leyline of Singularity. 2 blue enchantment. Of course, if it's in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. All non-land permanents are legendary, and of course, legendary means you can only have one of those things in play. So those treasure tokens are all legendary, right? They're going to be legendary artifacts, essentially. And the legend rule uses state-based actions, and state-based actions check whenever anybody has priority, and that essentially means you can't do anything until state-based actions happen. So yes, if your opponent, let's say, has a Dockside Extortionist, that Dockside Extortionist comes down, creates 3 treasure tokens. Before they have a chance to actually use them, 2 of them will go away. They'll get to keep 1, right? Because of course it's the legend rule. As soon as someone has the opportunity to do anything at all, state-based actions will check. They'll have to get rid of 2 of them, and they will only have 1. That's why effects like that are so good against treasure tokens. All right, if you choose to put your commander in graveyard instead of command zone when it dies, can you choose to move it to the command zone at a later time, or is it stuck in the graveyard? If you can move it, how does that work? So it doesn't work. No, you can't do that. How the ruling works with commanders in the format is pretty simple. If your commander changes zones, any zone, you can choose to put it in the command zone. Of course, this never used to be a thing. It used to be if your commander died, you had to leave it in the graveyard if you wanted to get the dice trigger, right? So if you had like a Child of Alara, which has a dice trigger, or Elenda was another commander that famously used to be a lot worse for this reason. If your commander died, you actually had to leave it in the graveyard in order to get the dice trigger. If you just put it in the command zone, you didn't get the dice trigger. They changed that. Now, anytime your commander changes zones, you can, if you want to, choose to put it in the command zone. And of course, what are the zones? Well, you got to go watch my zones video, of course, if you want a clearer description of what's going on there. But graveyard, library, exile, your hand, and of course, the battlefield are the zones, and obviously the command zone, but that's the one we're talking about here, right? So if your opponent bounces your commander to hand, you can choose to put it back in the command zone because it is changing zones. If your opponent, of course, tucks your commander on the bottom of the library, which is the reason they changed the tuck rule, because you actually used to be able to do that too. If they do that, of course, it's changing zones. You can choose to put it back in the command zone, which you likely will. Here's a tricky one though. If your opponent Oblivion Rings your commander or some effect like that, you can choose to put it in the command zone because of course it's changing zones. It's going to exile, or you can leave it in there because of course when that Oblivion Ring goes away, your commander comes back. But are there going to be some shenanigans there, right? You got to be careful sometimes with this stuff. Like a Containment Priest can really ruin your day in a situation like that, right? So exiling is the tricky one. If your opponent is sort of doing a Blink or Oblivion Ring effect on your commander, your instinct is to, okay, I'll leave it in the exile because I'm gonna get it back, or am I gonna get it back, right? Got to be careful with that one. No, you cannot change zones after the fact. You have to make the decision in that moment. If you send your commander to the graveyard, if you send your commander to exile or your hand or whatever, you got to make the decision in that moment. You can't change your mind afterward. Yes, your commander can absolutely get stuck in your graveyard or absolutely get stuck in exile, no question. Got to be careful there. Hi, for the card Decimate, if I use it on my opponent and it doesn't have all 4 targets available, can I still use it? Or if it did have 4 targets and my opponent sacks his creature that I targeted, does it still go through or a Decimate become fizzled? Is it the same as Gilded Drake? If I targeted the creature, he sacks it, what happens to the Gilded Drake? Thanks. So, a lot going on there, and of course we're going to have to look at a couple of cards here. Let's start with the last one and go in reverse. So Gilded Drake, 1 and a blue, Drake 3/3 with flying when Gilded Drake enters, exchange control of Gilded Drake and up to 1 other target creature an opponent controls. If you don't or can't make the exchange, sacrifice Gilded Drake. This ability still resolves if its target becomes illegal. Wow, did they ever errata the heck out of this card? And of course, the reason why is because with the original wording, you could get into some shenanigans. And of course, as Magic players always tend to do, they're trying to bend the rules as much as they can, as long as it's still in the rules of the game. So if you look at the errated text, right, it's always important to look at errated text on these cards, especially the older ones, and especially on a card like this, it has changed a lot. So it literally says on the errata text, if you don't or can't make the exchange, you have to sacrifice the Gilded Drake. This ability still resolves even if its target becomes illegal, right? So there you go. I think the errated text essentially answers that question. The rest of your question also has had a rules change. So Decimate, of course, 2 red and a green sorcery. Destroy target artifact, target creature, target enchantment, and target land. Of course, has been a staple for a long, long time, although has waned in popularity because of exactly what you say in your question. Yes, you do need all the targets. That's one of the reasons why people have shied away from this. If there is no enchantment on the battlefield, you cannot cast this, right? Whenever you cast a spell, you need to choose the targets when you put this spell on the stack. How it's supposed to work, we don't have to be super sticklers here, but how it's supposed to work is you're actually supposed to announce that you're casting a spell. I'm casting Decimate. Then you choose your targets. Then you pay the mana for that spell, which will actually be relevant in the next question. So that's the order you're supposed to do things, but you do absolutely have to choose your targets when a spell goes on the stack. So if there's no enchantment in play, you can't choose the target, so of course you can't cast the spell. So in order to cast a Decimate, you need an artifact, creature, enchantment, and land on the battlefield, and yes, it absolutely can be yours. And in fact, I have very often seen people do that because they have to get those other things off the battlefield. Now, the other part of the question is the part that we have the rules change, okay? It used to be the case, if I have 4 targets for my Decimate, my opponent sacrifices their creature in response. Because one of the targets for the spell is now not there, it's an illegal target, the spell will fizzle. That is no longer the case. Now all targets would have to be removed in order for the spell to fizzle. So even if your opponent sacrifices the artifact and the land and the creature, the enchantment will still get destroyed. Hope that answers that question. The next question, which I alluded to, is involved in the casting of spells and how the order of how you cast a spell actually matters. So if I played a Pearl Medallion, then went to play Norn's Annex, would Norn's Annex be 1 less to cast, or is there specifics that take place preventing that? So of course we got to look at these cards. Pearl Medallion, pretty simple, 2 mana artifact, white spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And Norn's Annex is 3 and 2 Phyrexian white mana artifact. Creatures can attack you or planeswalkers you control unless their controller pays a Phyrexian mana for each of those creatures. So I think the confusion comes in here because of the Phyrexian mana, possibly, but I will answer this question as broadly as I can so we can clarify a few things. Phyrexian mana is absolutely white mana, and this is absolutely a white card, right? Norn's Annex is a white card. You can only put it in a white commander deck. That's obviously important as well. And of course, Pearl Medallion says white spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And again, not a colorless mana, right? This is the generic mana. So we're looking at generic on our Norn's Annex, which has 3 generic mana. So with Pearl Medallion in play, this will cost 2 and the 2 Phyrexian mana. So of course, you can pay the 2 life for the Phyrexian mana instead of white mana, right? Again, you can pay white mana. This is a white spell, but you can pay the 2 life instead. So you can pay 4 life and have this only cost 2 with your Pearl Medallion in play. And the important part about casting, I will just throw this out there as well, because it is relatively important, because again, I had this come up in a game recently. Whenever you're casting a spell, again, that order of how things happen is pretty important. And whenever you're talking about cost reductions are always applied last. So I'm going to cast this spell. Let's figure out how much it costs. Maybe there's add-ons and additional cost to casting the spell, all of that. After all of that is calculated, you will then add on the cost reductions. Whatever the total mana is, I'm then going to minus off 1 generic mana with my Pearl Medallion, right? So that's also important to note. Let's end off with a really interesting one here. Question. A few weeks ago, someone in my playgroup used the -2 ability on Teo Geometric Tactician, a card that I have zero idea what it does. I obviously have to look it up. And then that player scooped. Why did they scoop? Not sure. And so my question is everyone still in the game beholden to an effect by a player no longer in the game? I tried looking it up online in the moment, but couldn't really find anything conclusive. But based on what you said in this video, I'm assuming that ability would affect the rest of us still in the game. That is a great question, and I hope I have the right answer here. So let's look up this guy, Teo Geometric Tactician. I guess came out in Commander Masters. This is my first time ever seeing this card. 2 and a white, Planeswalker, of course. Teo has 3 loyalty counters on it. When it enters the battlefield, create an 0/4 white wall creature token with Defender and flying. +1, you and target opponent each draw a card. And -2, of course, is the ability we're talking about here. Choose left or right until your next turn. Each player may attack only the nearest opponent in the last chosen direction, and Planeswalkers controlled by that opponent. Okay. So yeah, this is a funny interaction. And one of these things, again, this until your next turn thing is a thing that is on a lot of cards. I'm quite certain I know the answer here. This definitely would be a tough one to find online for sure. Someone can correct me in the comments below if I'm wrong, but I'm quite certain until your next turn, since that's never going to happen, then this wouldn't apply at all, right? If that person just left the game, this effect is no longer relevant because there is no until your next turn, right? So maybe in a way you could think of it as fizzling because there is no until your next turn because that person's no longer in the game. So yes, I think if someone activated this ability, I mean, is this person just trying to be a dink by activating this ability and then leaving the game because they think it's funny? It's entirely possible. I'll just say this, regardless of the ruling here, if someone does stuff like that, at the end of the day, the 3 people left in the game can sort of make their own decision about it, right? I know that maybe even sometimes it's outside of the rules, but yeah, I mean, it is Commander, right? And the rule 0 discussion is not only at the start of the game, but it kind of goes throughout the game as well. And if somebody kind of does this really annoying dickhead thing in a game, the other 3 players can undo it if they want to. It's sort of a democracy in a Commander game, right? I will say, I think the official ruling here likely is until your next turn doesn't apply if that person is not gonna have another turn. Maybe people might think that this effect would be turned on forever, but it's actually the opposite. I'll throw out another neat example here. There is actually people out there, and I used to have a patron with a deck like this that puts those until your next turn effects on the stack and then skips their next turn. So there's a few cards out there that will skip your next turn, right? It's essentially a skip your turn deck so that the until your next turn thing doesn't actually happen. In that situation, it would actually work because until your next turn, you keep delaying and delaying and delaying. Really interesting deck idea for someone if they want to go after it. But in this case, there is no next turn, so I think this effect will just not happen at all. That's my guess. I believe I'm pretty right about that. You guys let me know in the comments below if I'm not right about that. Otherwise, let me know in the comments below if you have any interesting rules, questions, or interactions that you want me to talk about in the next video. That is it for today, though, and thanks for tuning in.